I really think of all complex emotional and mental disorders, as well as addictive disorders, as being driven by three things: the biochemistry, the brain, our emotional and psychological history and current issues, as well as our spiritual life. And if there are problems in any of those, we're going to have problems in our life. We're going to have problems coping with stress, problems keeping balanced, problems expressing the fullness of who we were created to be.
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you, and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. Christina Veselak, thank you so much for being on the Mind Health 360 show. I'm very, very grateful. And you are fascinating. So you are a nutritionist and a psychotherapist specializing in the field of addiction, recovery, and mental health. And you're the founder and director of the Academy for Addiction and Mental Health Nutrition, which teaches practitioners how to use diet, along with amino acid and nutrient therapy, to prevent cravings and relapse by restoring neurotransmitter function. And you currently provide online relapse prevention, recovery coaching, and mental health nutrition to a wide variety of clients through your clinic, Garden Gate Counseling, and consultation. You're an experienced public speaker, and you've presented at conferences and trainings around the country. You also consult for supplement companies and residential treatment programs, helping them to integrate their life-saving nutritional approaches into their offerings. And you're a founding member and former executive director of the Alliance for Addiction Solutions, which is a non-for-profit organization which promotes the use of nutritional and other natural modalities to support repair of the addicted brain. Your website is aminoacidtherapy.com. Now, I'm really excited to interview you because I think, one of the things that you really bring to the table is a combination of psychotherapeutic experience. So you're a psychotherapist, but you're also a nutrition. And so you manage to marry these two aspects. So I imagine that you've spent a lot of time and have a lot of experience in dealing with sort of, trauma and psychological, spiritual issues. But you also cover the biochemistry and the brain health from a biochemical perspective, given your nutritional experiences or experience. And I think that's quite rare because we tend to sort of silo the two and separate the two. And I think it's really important to treat them together. So what I'd love to ask you, and I have so many questions, but I've heard your story. You have a very interesting story. I don't know if you want to start by that, or if you want to dive right in and start talking about how you work with clients and what your theories are in terms of, I've heard you say, that it's really important to have optimal brain health so that you can sustain the sort of natural stressors of life. So how would you go about explaining your sort of philosophy and your approach?
Three-legged stool. Thank you, Kirkland, because that was a great starting question. I really think of all complex emotional and mental disorders, as well as addictive disorders, as being driven by three things: the biochemistry, the brain, our emotional and psychological history and current issues, as well as our spiritual life. And if there are problems in any of those, we're going to have problems in our life. We're going to have problems coping with stress, problems keeping balanced, problems expressing the fullness of who we were created to be. And so it's been my experience that we need to be addressing all three at approximately the same time, maybe with different emphases at different time, but approximately the same time. That said, though, our brain drives everything, Kirkland. everything. Everything is mediated through our brain. Our feelings, our thoughts, our perceptions, our beliefs about ourselves, our ability to utilize the skills that our therapists are trying to teach us, right? Our ability to even access those skills are all mediated by the brain. So if it's offline, we have a much harder time engaging in any recovery process.
Completely.
We just can't do it optimally. Can we do it at all? Yes, of course, but optimally, no. And we want to thrive, right? We don't want to just crawl along. We want to leap and joy and, bound along. I know some of you listening would like that.
I know that in a lot of sort of current addiction treatments, it's very much focused on sort of the 12-step programs, on psychotherapy, but I've always felt that they sort of miss a trick with the biochemistry and the nutrition. And a lot of rehabs don't actually take those things into account. And I've always wondered if that's correlated with the very high relapse rate. And I know that your specialty is to work on relapse prevention. And can you talk us through that a little bit?
Well, yes. It's the idea of trying to sit on a three-legged stool that only has two legs. Okay, maybe you can manage if you put a lot of effort into staying balanced. But the moment a breeze hits, right, you topple right over because you are not in balance. So by missing the biochemical piece, they are keeping their clients from exercising a profound tool. So there's a couple of areas in which not feeding the brain leads us to relapse. One, and you'll hear me talk about this over and over again, is low blood sugar. So our brain actually, especially the prefrontal cortex, and this is crucial, and a lot of research, they've done a lot of research on the role of the prefrontal cortex in recovery and preventing relapse. Well, it turns out that for the prefrontal PFC to function optimally, it needs to be fed optimally. Blood sugar actually has to be at normal levels so that it is receiving enough fuel to function. They've done studies that have shown that if glucose levels drop in the body, i.e. low blood sugar, i.e. missing one or two meals, that our ability to exercise willpower goes away.
Yeah.
And they've done studies about decision-making, that a hungry prefrontal cortex does not make appropriate decisions.
And I think that's absolutely true. And what impacts the ability of the PFC to get the right glucose or ketones, whatever fuel it's using? What determines that? Is it simply how often we eat, or are there other things that can prevent the fuel from getting into the brain?
Typically, it's how often we eat and what we eat. Okay. We really recommend that people who are struggling eat at least 15 to 20 grams of protein every 3 to 4 hours. Premenstrual women, our blood sugar becomes more dysregulated near the end of our cycle. We do better often, and this isn't true for everybody, but typically we do better eating protein every 3 hours rather than every 4 hours. Most women, when we relapse premenstrually.
I heard you say that actually on another podcast, and I was fascinated. And you also said that most women who are put in jail are put in jail premenstrually as well, which I think is fascinating.
Well, and a student of mine just called me yesterday saying that there's somebody in one of her recovery groups, somewhat older woman, very affluent, who's about to do jail time because she's been arrested again for shoplifting. She stole an $8 hammer. And even though she's been shoplifting her whole life, this has gotten way worse over the last 3 years. And it's the 4 years, the 2 years before our bleeding stops and the 2 years after, that women appear to be at highest risk for all sorts of things.
Interesting. Okay.
And And so it's not just PMS, it's also menopause, anytime our hormones go a little wacky. And so the first question I'm having my student ask her friend is, where are you in relationship to menopause? And I bet you she's going to say she's smack in the middle of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what does that tell us then about, hormones and the impact of hormones on the brain and hormones on the addicted brain?
Well, yesterday, I guess Saturday, we had our monthly community forum. And I'm bringing that up because I want to let all of the listeners know that we do offer this once a month, and it is free. And it's an opportunity for people to engage around issues of nutrition and mental health. Mm-hmm. And our topic on Saturday was hormones.
Interesting. So we'll put that in the show notes. And if you tell us, is there a way that people can find this?
Yes, they can actually sign up on our new website.
Okay.
We're doing a calendar thing, but it is free. So you can access the Zoom link there. And, we would love to see more people because we have wonderful, lively conversations.
I can imagine. And I mean, hormones is such a key factor in mental health, but I'm interested also in the fact that I suppose maybe it's linked to the serotonin pathways through estrogen and the GABA pathways through progesterone.
Well, it is. And again, what we found near the end of a woman's cycle is that as estrogen drops, so does serotonin. And since amino acids is my specialty, and preventing relapse is my specialty, we'll have a lot of our recovering women increase their 5-HTP or tryptophan near the end of their cycle to prevent cravings and to prevent emotional, instability and getting arrested for shoplifting and things like that.
So interesting. Okay, so we've spoken about blood sugar and its impact on the prefrontal cortex and its impact on sort of addiction and relapse. We've spoken a little bit about hormones and the same thing. And there are so many other things that I think impact, predispose us to addiction by depleting the brain nutrients. Mm-hmm. And I heard you talk about genetics, for instance, and saying that, you now do this genetic testing that determines what type of substance you might be more predisposed to genetically. And I found that fascinating. Can you talk us through that?
Yes. So Dr. Kenneth Blum started out as a psychopharmaceutical researcher in the 70s, I think, and 80s. And very quickly, he moved into genetic research. And he discovered that for certain, well, actually it turns out to be more than just certain, for a lot of very heavy drinkers, there is a particular issue with dopamine receptors in the brain. So that basically boils down to the ability to feel pleasure and reward. Mm-hmm. And that this genetic issue runs through addicted families, it runs through the entire extended family. And it manifests not just as problems with alcohol, but also perhaps compulsive overeating or gambling or ADHD. And to make a very long story short, what he's discovered is that as we've all been taught, addiction is about needing to fire dopamine in the pleasure center of the brain. Mm-hmm. But what he discovered is that all the neurotransmitters play a part in this. GABA, serotonin, the endorphins, some others as well, including dopamine. And therefore, genetic issues in the production and firing of any of those pathways will impact the firing of dopamine in the pleasure center, thus leading us falling short in life, like wanting a little more, needing a little more, not behaving the way society and we want us to be. Because conduct disorder and ADHD is part of this. And so what he's actually identified 10 very specific SNPs or genetic polymorphisms that drive this. And he finds that if somebody has an issue in any of these, they're going to have problems ultimately firing in the nucleus accumbens and therefore craving something. So this brain, this lacking this, once it finds the drug of choice that opens that blocked pathway, it's like, my brain's working. I feel good. Ooh, I feel normal. I want more. I want to feel normal more often, right? We all do. I want to feel good more often. And so then we get on the addictive spiral and off we're spiraling. So this test can be used with youngsters to identify where and how they're at risk. And then he has supplements, and a lot of these you can buy over the counter, amino acids and other nutrients to support those pathways, even in young children, to allow them a very different trajectory in life.
That's fascinating. And is this what you refer to as the reward deficiency syndrome?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I heard you talking about that. And basically what you're saying is that most people who become addicted to substances or behaviors, it's because there's some sort of deficiency in their reward pathways, essentially.
Yes.
And you're saying that these
we can identify.
And we can identify which ones. And what you're saying is that this reward pathway is fed into not just by dopamine, which is the obvious neurotransmitter that we think of, but also by serotonin and GABA and endorphins and all these other sort of neurotransmitters. They all have this impact on dopamine.
Yes.
Is that how it works? And that basically, if there's a dysfunction in that, then essentially we will be running low on dopamine, and therefore we'll be wanting to engage in behaviors and substances that boost our dopamine, which will make us feel more pleasure and more motivation and more energy and more excitement. Is that correct?
Very succinctly put. That's exactly right.
Okay, perfect. And so I guess the question is, if you know that you have this, and it's fascinating that he's identified 10 SNPs, genetic polymorphisms, to sort of identify this, I guess it's a cohesion of biochemical imbalances that then combine to form this reward deficiency syndrome. What do you do about it? What can you do about it?
Diet and amino acids.
Okay, diet and amino acids. And this is your specialty.
Diet, because to make neurotransmitters, our brain needs the right amino acids in the presence of vitamins and minerals. And ideally, we get that from the protein we eat and from the fruits and vegetables we eat. Okay. We need enough. And it's hard to get enough in today's world for a variety of reasons.
And so what you're saying is that essentially, so we need the right amino acids because they're the precursors to the neurotransmitters. Therefore, we need to eat enough protein. But equally, we also need the right cofactors, i.e. the right vitamins and minerals, which will then help us convert these amino acids into the right neurotransmitters. Is that correct?
Okay. That's correct.
And so, first of all, what do you do if you're not getting enough protein in your diet? Say you're a vegan, for instance, or if you're not absorbing enough protein because maybe you have low stomach acid, how do you address that?
So again, we want to address it from as many angles as possible, Kirkland, but this is where I believe in supplements to jumpstart the system and maybe continue it. I personally needed to be on a very high level of amino acids and other nutrients for a minimum of 10 years. I had been initially diagnosed with celiac disease when I was 2 years old. Apparently, I almost died. But at that point in time, they didn't know the connection with gluten. So I grew up eating gluten. I grew up ill. My mother knew something was wrong, was taking me from doctor to doctor. But because I started putting on weight, because my body was starving and was turning everything into fat, I started putting on weight when I was 8. The diagnosis got lost. They decided I was perfectly fine and my mother was a hypochondriac. Meanwhile, my whole life I had wanted to become a medical doctor, right? It was the only thing I wanted to do with my life. But when I graduated from college, I was too ill to have the stamina to make it through med school. I had the grades, I had the brains, I had the desire, I didn't have the stamina. And it's so ironic that it was the medical profession that had failed me in not being able to figure out what was wrong. And yet I wanted to join it. So I've come in through the back door.
Well, I mean, you're doing some incredible work, and probably, you know, I always believe that the universe has a plan for us, and you know, this was the plan. But it's amazing that you were diagnosed with celiac, and at the time they hadn't made the correlation with gluten. They hadn't made that connection. That's fascinating. And so in terms of sort of diet and getting the right proteins and the right nutrients to make the right amino acids, what would you recommend? I mean, what are the blockages to that apart from being vegan and not having enough stomach acid? And what can we do to address those blockages?
Well, so those are big blockages. So this is where I really recommend, we have an assessment tool that was developed by Julia Ross, who's a practitioner in California. I met her about 30 years ago, and it was actually her nutritionist who figured out what was wrong with me.
Wow.
Thank you, Kristen. And she was one of the first practitioners in the country to be using amino acids with addictive disorders and eating disorders. And she's come up with an assessment tool that's just simply based, we know what our symptoms are when neurotransmitters are depleted. That research has been done. So this is just a simple symptom survey that is very effective in identifying what neurotransmitters are depleted and need support. And then we just bring in the right amino acids. Amino acids taken orally can turn into the neurotransmitters within 20 minutes. Wow. 20 minutes, we can have a shift in mood. We can have more energy. We can have less anxiety. We can fall asleep easier, so on and so forth. And the most wonderful thing about aminos, Kirkland, is that they're anti-addictive. Okay, because rather than building tolerance, tolerance is about depleting your neurotransmitters over time. When we use aminos, we are rebuilding the neurotransmitters. So over time, we get to take less and less to get the same effect rather than more and more.
That's fascinating. So if we take an example, a benzo addiction, somebody who's a benzo addict, and you know, their benzo addiction over the years, whether it's Valium or diazepam or whatever, all derivatives of Valium, basically, so their GABA levels have been severely depleted to the point where, you know, they're very deficient in GABA. So are you saying that if they take a GABA supplement, which is out there and exists, that by taking that GABA supplement, they're actually rebuilding their GABA levels naturally and rebuilding their body's endogenous ability or internal ability to create endogenous GABA?
Yes. Now, benzo addiction is a little trickier than that. And some people, I just had a sort of virtual conversation with someone who says that a lot of people coming off benzos really overreact to any benzo supplement, any GABA support supplement. I personally have not found that, though, in my practice. In my practice, I have found that people respond beautifully to GABA support, whether it be GABA itself or a combination of GABA support nutrients, or one of my favorite amino acids, L-theanine. A lot of my clients coming off benzos do beautifully on theanine, and sometimes they need actually a large amount, 400 milligrams at a time, you know, up to 4 times a day, to overcome the effect of a taper. But it works beautifully. And, you know, anybody who needs GABA support, you know, they say that GABA doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier because it's a neurotransmitter and therefore too big. And again, I have not seen that in my practice. I have seen that people respond beautifully to even very low doses of GABA.
Interesting. And also, would you recommend people take glutamine? Because I know that that can become GABA, essentially. So it's a precursor to GABA. I mean, it can also become glutamate, but yeah.
I do. And some people find glutamine very calming, but where glutamine shines is in this low blood sugar thing.
Yeah.
So circling back to low blood sugar, and when blood sugar drops, the prefrontal cortex can go offline, and adrenaline kicks in. So whenever blood sugar drops too low or too fast, we get an adrenaline surge. And this adrenaline can do all sorts of bad things. It can lead to violence. It can lead to panic attacks. It can lead to cravings and relapse. But what we found happens is when we take glutamine, the prefrontal cortex uses it as fuel and appears to turn off that adrenaline response. People calm down, people start thinking, they start focusing, the cravings go away. So 500 to 1,000 milligrams of glutamine, when you can't get to food, we don't want to use it in place of food, but when you can't get to food, works beautifully to stabilize your mood, your behavior, and make your cravings go away. Until you can then eat. So I recommend that all my clients who have unstable blood sugar carry a little baggie of glutamine with them. Or for some people like nurses who can't really stop and take a pill, I have them mix it in with their water. So they're sipping on it throughout the day and getting that constant fueling of their brain.
That's fantastic. I mean, glutamine is definitely one of my favorites. I have heard that you should be a little bit cautious if you're bipolar. Is that correct in terms of using glutamine? There can be some adverse.
There can be, and that's because bipolar is often driven by high glutamate, and glutamine turns into glutamate before it turns into GABA.
Interesting.
So you just have to sort of figure that out for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe just use a lower dose.
Yeah. Okay, understood. Okay, so that's fantastic. And if we look, so we've talked a little bit, we're talking about the different factors that impact our brain health and our ability to sort of withstand addiction and to keep our brain so that it's, replete with the right neurotransmitters. So we've talked a little bit about genetics and hormones and blood sugar. You mentioned in another podcast, you also mentioned pyroluria as a condition that can predispose to addiction. Pyroluria being a sort of genetic condition that causes social anxiety and causes low B6 and zinc. Is that correct? I'd never heard that before. I'd be fascinated to find out more.
Right. And unfortunately, most people haven't heard of it, and most psychiatrists haven't heard of it. And I think this is one of these unconscionable things out there in the mental health professional world. So, which is why I get on podcasts like this to educate the world. Pyroluria was first identified in the 50s by two orthomolecular psychiatrists, Dr. Abram Hoffer and Dr. Carl Pfeiffer. And what they discovered is first in schizophrenics, but also other people, what they called a MOVE factor in their urine. That actually, if you have very severe pyroluria, which means you have a very high level of this chemical called Cryptopyrrole, it can actually turn your urine slightly purple. Wow. Most people, don't get that severe, but some people can. And it's rather complicated. I'm going to simplify it here a bit, but essentially in the production of heme, which is the iron-containing portion of your red blood cell, in its production, this chemical called Cryptopyrrole is produced. And typically the body can just urinate it out, no problem. But sometimes too much is produced, and it's not excreted quickly enough, and it binds to both zinc and B6, and then the whole thing is excreted. Well, zinc and B6 are two of our primary cofactors, we've talked about cofactors, to turn the aminos into neurotransmitters. If we don't have them, we cannot make that conversion. And people aren't always eating enough foods with B6 and zinc in them, right? So we become deficient.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think also the other thing is that those are also cofactors in producing the right hormones. So progesterone, estrogen, you need the zinc and the B6 in order to produce the right hormones as well as the right neurotransmitters. So that's a double whammy.
It's a double whammy. And it can impact behavior and mood in so many different ways. But there are some typically common symptoms. One is this social anxiety from day one, but it can get worse with age. It can get worse with stress as our body depletes B6 and zinc even more. And it can lead to stress intolerance. So, some people, when things get stressful, we just sort of gear up and jump into the fray. Other people have a much, much harder time, and in fact can feel really bad about themselves because they don't do well when things get more stressful. And this is unfortunate. See, this is where as human beings, we feel a lot of shame when we don't do things as well as we perceive our neighbors doing, whether it be, stepping up to stress or focusing or concentrating or. And so stress intolerance is one of the symptoms of pyroluria, and it can impact people in so many different ways. And then it can also influence people towards ADHD, depression, generalized anxiety, you name it, zinc and B6 are found somewhere in it, right? So deficiencies in it can impact us in a variety of different ways. It is hard to test for in a conventional lab because cryptopyrroles are very sensitive molecules and degrade easily. So you need to use a specialty lab that knows how to handle the sample with care. There is a lab in England, there's a lab in the Netherlands, there's at least 2 labs in the United States I like. But you can't just go to your doctor and go to an ordinary lab. No. Unfortunately, where I recommend people start is with a Pyroluria questionnaire. And Trudy Scott, and I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of Trudy. Trudy herself suffered from pyroluria, and addressing it has made all the difference in her life. And so she has quite a bit of information on it on her website, and also has a good pyroluria questionnaire on her website.
Yeah. That's a great call, actually. And that's actually where I first heard about it, was from Trudy. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the other things, obviously, we've spoken a little bit about poor diet, lack of protein, poor blood sugar control. And the other thing I heard you mention was that neuroinflammation can also prevent the conversion of amino acid into neurotransmitters. And if that's the case, there's so many things that can cause inflammation, neuroinflammation, whether it's a diet that's too high in sugars or stress. But do you want to talk a little bit? I hadn't heard that before. I'm sure, that neuroinflammation can sort of hamper this conversion of amino acids into neurotransmitters.
Yes, and it partly has to do with a word nobody's heard of, and that's tetrahydrobiopterin, or BH4. But before I talk about BH4, I want to share an interesting story with you. And that is a student of mine a couple months ago brought up her boss, actually, at a residential treatment program, who'd been acting quite bizarrely over the previous 4 months, to the point that people thought that she had relapsed back into alcohol and benzo use. And because she was having memory losses, she was just being weird. She was thinking she was overworking when actually she wasn't actually coming to work. And then finally, right before my student talked to me, she confessed that she had just gotten a prescription for Xanax and had a drink because it felt like her brain was on fire. Well, what a wonderful metaphor for neuroinflammation.
Absolutely.
Well, part of the story is that she had tested positive for COVID 4 months earlier, right around the time that she started behaving oddly, and then had again gotten a reinfection, which we all know is rare, but unfortunately appears to happen. just about a week early, had tested positive again, right when she felt like her brain had gone on fire.
Interesting.
And I suggested that she was having both acute as well as post-COVID neuroinflammation. I was reading about this a little bit, though nobody had talked about the symptom of your brain being on fire. And so I recommended that she go on anti-inflammatory herbs and nutrients, including very high dose fish oil. And this woman did, and within a couple of days, she started feeling normal again. And in the middle of the craziness, she actually had quit her job. And then she was able to stabilize herself, staying on these nutrients, and got another job and is thriving again.
Amazing. And so what are the nutrients apart from fish oil that you would recommend, the herbs and the nutrients that are anti-inflammatory for the brain?
So things like skullcap, especially Chinese skullcap, and acetylcysteine, a herb called bacopa. What else did and she wasn't able to find all of these. I think she landed on the fish oil and acetylcysteine, and maybe one other thing that I'm just not remembering right now. And it worked beautifully.
Yeah, I mean, totally. And, you know, so much now we know that whether it's depression or anxiety or panic or poor cognition, so much of it is due to neuroinflammation.
It is.
And so, you know, bringing your inflammatory markers down and your inflammatory chemicals down is absolutely key. And, you know, one of the things also you as a psychotherapist have probably come across a lot is sort of childhood trauma, chronic stress, which we know can be very neuroinflammatory.
Yes.
And we know that there's a big correlation between those experiences and addiction. Can you talk us through that as a psychotherapist and an addiction specialist and the relation that it has with your knowledge of nutrition and amino acid therapy, et cetera?
Okay. So there's a couple of steps there. In terms of neuroinflammation, there is a brain cell called the microglial, and the microglial cell produces inflammatory chemicals. And it is, quote, upregulated by a number of things that will then intersect with each other. So physical trauma, emotional trauma, food intolerances, toxins, etc., will all combine, you know, sort of like the tipping point, right? The straw that breaks the camel's back. Well, at some point that, you know, one final straw upregulates the microglial that don't have the ability to turn themselves off, and they start pounding out these inflammatory chemicals.
Interesting.
So we can actually quench them using some of these nutrients, but also we want to take all these different straws off the camel's back. And this is where healing childhood trauma can help tremendously as one of the, you know, straw reduction techniques and stress reduction techniques. And, you know, I've been a trauma specialist for a long time, and I really love EMDR. I really love inner child work. I tell people that as a psychotherapist, there are 3 tools in my practice I would never be without: EMDR, inner child work, and amino acids. Because they all work so quickly to reduce symptoms and restore stability, especially when you're using them together.
I love that. And that's what I love about what you do, is that you manage to combine those, you know, healing modalities, the biochemical and the psychospiritual, in a really compelling way. And I mean, to me, that's the only way to really truly heal. But so, you know, well done.
We also need to talk about the adrenals. Because when we're talking about both ongoing child, you know, initiated stress, we're talking about any sort of PTSD or any sort of ongoing trauma or ongoing stress, such as being a family member of somebody with an active addictive disorder. Okay, because addictive disorders tend to bring a lot of chaos and a lot of pain into families. And if you've grown up in such a family, or you are a spouse in such a family, or a parent of a child who's coming in, drunk at 17 at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you don't know, what he's been driving, right? This stress over time takes its toll on your entire body. It depletes all your nutrients. It depletes all your neurotransmitters. It also stresses out and depletes your adrenals. And so one of the things we have to do when somebody's been in this incredibly stressful situation, and ongoing PTSD is an incredibly stressful situation for a long time, is to come in and support the adrenals.
Yeah, completely. And how do you do that? What is your mechanism for doing that to support the adrenals?
So first of all, we have to really encourage people to be paying attention to self-care. To start, and especially people in addictive families whose focus so much is on managing the person with the active addiction that self-care goes out the window. So we really have to be encouraging people back towards self-care and sleeping and eating and getting that blood sugar stable and. Okay, we use all of our nutrients, our multivitamin, our fish oil, our neurotransmitter supports, all of those amino acids. But then we can also come in and use adrenal support nutrients. They're called adaptogens, and they're herbs that can either give us more energy by supporting cortisol production or help us calm down by quenching over cortisol production and over adrenaline. Theanine, again, is very useful here. But for energizing, we've got maca, rhodiola, and the ginsengs. For calming, we've got holy basil and ashwagandha and a few others. And sometimes you just combine them and you get this nice balanced effect. But what a lot of people don't realize, Kirkland, in our world of, it's not quite as bad as it used to be, but this low fat craze and cardiologists not wanting people's cholesterol to be too high, is that people can actually have too low cholesterol.
Absolutely.
And what's important to understand is all of our adrenal hormones, and therefore all of our reproductive hormones, are made from cholesterol.
Completely.
Cholesterol is the beginning of all of these pathways. So if our cholesterol has gotten too low, and some people are saying that total cholesterol under 160 is too low, that people will have symptoms. They've done big population studies where they've shown that there is a higher incidence of suicide and homicide if cholesterol has gotten too low in the population. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised, but yeah, I mean, I've heard that, but this craze about statins. So many people are on statins to lower the cholesterol. And I always wonder what effect that's having on people's mental health, essentially.
It can be profound.
No, I can imagine.
Yeah.
And so if you look at all these different factors that impact our brains and essentially predispose us in some sense to addiction because we're trying to self-medicate, and we're trying to address sort of nutritional deficiencies or deficiencies in our neurotransmitters so that we can feel better. Do you find that by using your approach, you actually get really notable solutions and notable outcomes and real success stories?
Yes. So there will always be people who slip through the cracks for whatever reason. But in many, many treatment programs, they have an 80 to 100% relapse rate.
Yeah.
Actually, truly. I've worked in one program where they had 100% relapse rate. This is tragic.
Tragic.
When we bring this approach in, when we start teaching people, so a lot of treatment programs feed their clients well, so people feel better quickly, but then they leave the program and they go back to their old eating patterns. and they go downhill very, very quickly. So food is not enough. Education is not enough. We need to combine food and teach our clients everything we've been talking about today so that they know why eating better makes a difference. We're all supposed to eat healthy. We all know this, but nobody knows exactly what that means. And of course, it's a little different from person to person, but nobody talks about why it matters for mental health and addiction recovery. Kirkland, I want to get nutrition into the conversation.
Yeah, totally.
It's so vital to make it part of the conversation as to recovery. So when programs bring this approach in, their relapse rate has dropped to 20%.
Wow. That's amazing. So why do more programs not do this? Why is this not more mainstream in the addiction community?
Because there's not enough robust evidence, right? Everybody has to be evidence-based. And while we do have research, we don't have enough research. It also takes a little more money, a little more care, a little more attention. Most of the psychiatrists aren't trained in this approach, and so they're not going to jump on board. It's multifactored, but mostly it's because nobody's heard about it.
Yeah.
It's just not being taught in school. None of us were taught this in school.
Yeah.
The brain is kind of ignored, it's shoved over there somewhere other than to throw medication at it.
Yeah, completely.
And this is tragic. And I want to get on the rooftops and start shouting this information to the entire world.
Yeah.
And in fact, Kirkland, I do have a project that is starting, and I'm going to be fundraising to start a billboard project somewhere in this country. We haven't quite decided where it's going to be yet, with the very simple message of eat protein every 4 hours.
Amazing.
I'm going to leave it up to the billboard designers as to how they say this, but we're going to be fundraising to hire a high-level illustrator to start a billboard campaign to shout this from the rooftops, because I believe so passionately about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I'm completely with you. And it's criminal that so many people are left to sort of white knuckle through sobriety without optimizing their biochemistry and their brain health. And, which would make sobriety so much easier.
I cannot tell you the number of people who come to me with tears in their eyes, asking me, why has nobody taught me this before?
Yeah.
I've been through 3 treatment programs. Why did nobody ever mention this? It has changed my life, they tell me.
Completely.
People in domestic violence programs come to me, these big burly men who've been arrested for beating up their wives and their children. If I sub in one of their classes and teach them this, I challenge them all. Go for 1 week eating protein every 4 hours and see what changes, and maybe stop drinking Mountain Dew. And they meet me in the hallway with tears in their eyes and say, why has nobody taught me this before? I didn't have one violent outburst this entire week. I was able to cope with stress. I was able to respond with all the tools I've been taught. Why did nobody ever teach me this before?
Completely. And what if you're a vegan or a vegetarian? I mean, when you say eat protein, does it have to be animal protein? Or I know it's easier, but can you also have the same effects with vegetable protein?
You can. It's harder. There's less amounts of tyrosine and L-phenylalanine, which directly turn into dopamine in your plant-based proteins. You really need to supplement more. Yeah. And you just need to be really, really careful to make sure you're getting your 60 to 80 grams of protein a day, which is what we recommend. Yeah. Minimum. And so many people, vegans, but also not vegans, aren't getting enough protein in their diet because they haven't been taught why it's important and they don't think about it.
Yeah. And are there any other factors apart from not eating enough protein that, gut factors? So I know the gut-brain connection is very important, and, presumably the digestion of protein and the absorption of nutrients has a huge impact on the neurotransmitters and the hormones as well. So do you in your practice look at the gut and, if somebody's eating enough protein, but they're not actually, nothing's really changing, do you then look at the gut, or where would you look then?
Well, I do. And this is where I'd like to talk a little bit about my school. So I run the Academy for Addiction and Mental Health Nutrition to teach practitioners all these approaches. And it's divided into two parts, Kirkland. We have our level 1 training, which is 5 months. And there we teach amino acid therapy. We want our practitioners to become competent and confident and proficient in the use of amino acid therapy and diet.
Yeah.
And using our amino acid therapy chart, the assessment tool. And what I teach about this tool and this approach is that it works 80% of the time.
Okay.
But 20% of the time in clinical practice, it doesn't work. You aren't getting the desired change with just changing your diet and bringing in the supplements. And this is because there's another underlying condition going on. So my level 2 certification training is an 8-month program, because actually there are a lot of these factors that can get in the way. And we apply the tenets of functional medicine to mental health and addiction recovery, step by step by step. So the first month we talk about digestion and the microbiome and how to support the microbiome using fiber, using prebiotics, and removing from your diet the things that are going to stress your good guys. And then we look at food intolerances, hormones, your reproductive hormones, your thyroid, your adrenals, toxicity, and inflammation, as we talked about before. And I'm not trying to make functional nutritionists out of all my little addiction counselors. But what I am trying to do is teach everybody how to recognize when these might be going on for your clients, when they might be the blocks to recovery, because all of these conditions do have recognizable symptoms. And then to know to whom to refer their clients for appropriate treatment.
Absolutely. And another one presumably is infections. That's the other thing that can be a block, which needs sort of specialist treatment. So things like Lyme's disease and EBV and these viruses and bacteria. Okay. And that can also interfere. Well, that's super interesting, Christina. I must say, you are such a wealth of information and knowledge, and your patients are very lucky to have you. And I'm going to put all your information on how to reach you in the show notes. Is there anything else that I think we've covered quite a lot in this short time, but is there anything that we've forgotten to mention? Or
I think we're pretty good.
I think that was really good. I think that was really fantastic, and just such a wealth of information. And, I think just keep doing the amazing work that you're doing, trying to get the addiction community and the mental health community more aware and better equipped in how to deal with these deficiencies and these biochemical imbalances, and how to look at the 360-degree picture for optimal mental health and for relapse prevention. So thank you for everything that you do, Christina.
Well, Kirkland, thank you so much for having me on this show of yours. It's been wonderful. And thank you for everything you do as well in educating the world, because that's my passion, educating the world.
We share that. So thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.